November 14th, 1941, central London. Inside a nondescript brick building on Broadway, 3 blocks from Westminster Abbey, the folder landed on the mahogany desk with a sound that seemed too soft for the weight of its contents. Major Geoffrey Harrison of British Military Intelligence stared at the typewritten pages, his tea growing cold in its porcelain cup. The document bore stamps from multiple departments: signals intelligence, photographic reconnaissance, human intelligence networks operating inside the Soviet Union. All of them told the same impossible story. The Soviets claimed they were moving their entire industrial base eastward. Not some factories, not a strategic selection of critical facilities. Everything. Harrison traced his finger down the columns of numbers that a signals officer had decrypted from Soviet internal communications 3 days earlier. 1,523 industrial enterprises. The number sat there on the page like a mathematical error that nobody had caught. Steel mills that employed 20,000 workers, aircraft plants spanning 40 acres, tank factories with foundries that couldn't be moved without specialized railway equipment that didn't exist. Harrison had spent 4 years analyzing German industrial capacity before the war. He understood precisely what it meant to relocate a factory. A small machine shop could be packed into railway cars and moved in a week, perhaps 2. A proper industrial facility with blast furnaces, rolling mills, precision tooling equipment required months of careful planning and methodical execution. You needed to shut down production, carefully dismantle machinery in reverse order of assembly, crate everything, arrange transportation, prepare a receiving site with foundations and utilities, and rebuild. The British had attempted to relocate exactly 7 factories from southern England to the Midlands in 1940, fearing German invasion. 3 of them never resumed production. The logistical challenges had proven insurmountable despite Britain's intact railway system and stable industrial infrastructure. The Soviets were claiming they had moved 1,500 factories in 3 months while fighting the largest invasion in human history. Harrison pulled the reconnaissance photographs from the folder's second section. RAF pilots flying modified Spitfires had pushed their aircraft to maximum range over the Baltic, photographing Soviet rail lines from extreme altitude. The images showed something that shouldn't exist according to every principle of industrial logistics. An unbroken stream of freight trains moving eastward, so densely packed that analysts counted 1 train every 11 minutes on certain routes. The photo interpreters had marked hundreds of trains with red pencil, noting flat cars loaded with industrial equipment, passenger cars packed with workers, livestock cars carrying God knew what toward destinations in the Soviet interior. His assistant, Captain Robert Aldridge, stood near the window overlooking the Thames, holding a report from the Bletchley Park cryptographers. The government code and cipher school had been intercepting Soviet railway communications for weeks, not because Britain was spying on its new ally, but because the volume of radio traffic was impossible to ignore. German signals intelligence was intercepting the same communications, and British code breakers were reading German assessments of what the Soviets were doing. The Germans didn't believe it either. Aldridge read from the translated intercept. A Wehrmacht intelligence officer in Smolensk had reported witnessing the evacuation of the Kirov tank factory from Leningrad. The German analyst estimated the factory would need 6 months to relocate, and another year to resume production. He recommended ignoring the evacuation as a strategic factor for the 1942 campaign. The assessment was dated October 12th. According to Soviet communications that Bletchley Park analysts had decoded, that same Kirov factory had resumed limited production on November 8th in a new location designated as Factory Number 37, somewhere in the Ural Mountains region. 27 days from evacuation to renewed production. Harrison removed his glasses and cleaned them with a handkerchief, a habit that surfaced when data refused to make sense. The numbers created a picture of industrial mobilization that exceeded anything Germany or Britain could accomplish, and both nations had spent years preparing for mechanized warfare. The Soviets had lost Minsk in 6 days. Kiev had fallen in September with over 600,000 prisoners captured. German panzers were pushing toward Moscow while the temperature dropped toward winter extremes. And somehow, while divisions collapsed and cities burned, Soviet engineers were performing an industrial magic trick that Western military theory said couldn't be done. The folder contained one more document that made Harrison's carefully cultivated analytical detachment crack slightly. A decoded NKVD communication ordering the execution of any railway official who failed to maintain evacuation schedules. The penalty for allowing a factory train to arrive more than 12 hours late at its designated eastern destination was death. No trial, no appeals, immediate execution. They weren't just moving factories. They were doing it under threat of execution, with German armies sometimes less than 50 miles behind the last evacuation trains. Harrison closed the folder and looked across the desk at Aldridge. Someone needed to brief the Prime Minister. Someone needed to tell Winston Churchill that Britain's new Soviet allies were accomplishing something that military logistics said was impossible, that industrial engineering said was insane, and that strategic analysis said would determine whether the Eastern Front survived past spring. The afternoon light coming through the window had turned gray the way London light always did in November. Harrison wondered if Stalin's industrial exodus would matter, or if the Wehrmacht would simply overrun the Soviet Union before those relocated factories could produce enough tanks to change anything. He was about to find out he'd underestimated the Russians by an order of magnitude. October 16th, 1941. Kharkov, Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, 240 miles from the German front lines. The Kharkov Tractor Factory had manufactured agricultural equipment since 1931. Then Stalin's industrial planners redesigned its production lines for the T-34 tank, and the facility became one of the Soviet Union's primary armored vehicle plants. Director Yuri Maksarev had received his evacuation orders on October 8th. He had 8 days to dismantle and move a factory complex that sprawled across 118 acres. The workers began with the smallest equipment: lathes, drill presses, welding apparatus, precision measurement tools, everything that could be unbolted from concrete floors and loaded onto railway flat cars. The factory operated in shifts that no labor law contemplated. Engineers worked alongside teenage apprentices using cutting torches to separate machinery from foundations, while the furnaces still radiated heat from the previous shift's production. Women from the administrative offices wrapped electrical motors in canvas and straw, crating components that weighed hundreds of pounds. Maksarev walked through the main assembly hall at midnight, watching crews dismantle the overhead crane system that moved tank hulls between workstations. The cranes themselves weighed 40 tons. The railway flat cars waiting on the factory spur lines could handle 30 tons maximum. Engineers calculated load distributions while workers cut the cranes into sections, marking each piece with chalk numbers that would guide reassembly at an unknown destination 2,000 miles east. The NKVD liaison officer assigned to factory evacuation operations checked his watch every 30 minutes, comparing progress against the master schedule developed by the State Defense Committee in Moscow. The schedule allocated 9 days for the Kharkov Tractor Factory evacuation. Maksarev had requested 14. The NKVD officer reminded him that German reconnaissance aircraft had photographed the factory 3 times in the past week. Wehrmacht intelligence knew exactly where Soviet tank production was concentrated, and every factory location was a target for advancing panzer divisions. The railway workers arrived on October 14th with 173 freight cars. Maksarev needed at least 220. The railway commissar explained that every available car in the Ukrainian railway network was already allocated to evacuation operations. 17 major factories were moving simultaneously from the Kharkov region alone. The mathematics was simple and brutal. Fit everything essential into 173 cars or leave it for the Germans. Engineers made impossible decisions. The newest precision milling machines, purchased from American suppliers in 1940, went into the railway cars. Older Soviet-manufactured equipment, still functional but replaceable, stayed behind. The factory's complete technical library, 15,000 engineering drawings, process specifications, metallurgical formulas, filled 6 crates that received priority loading. The apprentice dormitory's furniture stayed. The cafeteria equipment stayed. The administrative building's filing cabinets, containing a decade of production records, stayed. Workers loaded the final railway cars on October 16th, 30 hours before the deadline. The convoy included factory equipment, raw materials, half-finished tank components, and 9,200 workers with their families. Maksarev watched the locomotive engineer receive his routing papers for a destination designated only as Point 112, somewhere in the Chelyabinsk region of the Urals. The distance was approximately 2,100 miles. The estimated travel time was 12 days, assuming no delays, no attacks from German aircraft, and no breakdowns on a railway system straining under unprecedented demand. The train pulled away from the Kharkov factory complex, while workers were still bolting down the last secured loads. Maksarev rode in a passenger car converted into a mobile headquarters, carrying the master equipment manifest that would guide reassembly. The document listed 7,342 separate items, from 50-ton stamping presses to boxes of precision drill bits. Every item needed to arrive intact. Every item needed to be reassembled in correct sequence. Every item was essential to resuming T-34 production before Germany could consolidate its territorial gains. 3 days after the evacuation train departed, German motorcycle reconnaissance units entered Kharkov. They found empty factory buildings, stripped foundations, and chalk marks on concrete floors showing where machinery had stood. The Wehrmacht intelligence assessment estimated the Soviets had salvaged perhaps 20% of the factory's productive capacity. They calculated the Kharkov Tractor Factory would never produce another tank. They were wrong by 600 tanks. October 28, 1941, Chelyabinsk Oblast, Soviet Union, eastern slopes of the Ural Mountains. The train carrying the Kharkov Tractor Factory arrived at point 112 13 days after departure. What the workers found waiting for them was not a prepared industrial site with foundations and utility connections. They found an open field covered in early snow with ground temperatures already dropping below freezing at night. Yuri Maksarev stepped off the passenger car into ankle-deep mud that the first snow hadn't yet frozen solid. The site designation coordinates placed them 8 miles from the nearest town, deliberately distant from any settlement that might attract German bombing if the Wehrmacht's long-range aircraft ever reached this far east. Survey stakes marked a rectangular area roughly matching the Kharkov factory's footprint. Beyond that, there was nothing. No buildings, no power lines, no water supply, no shelter for 9,000 workers who had just traveled 2,000 miles with whatever possessions they could carry. The local party chairman met Maksarev near the locomotive, holding paperwork that authorized the factory's reconstruction. The chairman explained that construction materials were being diverted from 3 collective farms in the region. Timber would arrive within 4 days. Cement supplies were requisitioned from a dam project 100 miles south. Electrical cables were being stripped from a mine that had closed in 1939. Nothing was new. Everything was borrowed, reassigned, or salvaged from other projects that Stalin's industrial planners had deemed less critical than restoring tank production. Workers unloaded the railway cars while engineers mapped the new factory layout on ground that would need to be leveled before any foundations could be poured. The heaviest equipment came off first, the stamping presses that shaped T-34 armor plates, the heat treatment furnaces for turret rings, the assembly line machinery that married hulls to running gear. Each piece was positioned on a temporary wooden supports that kept metal components off the frozen ground. The machinery sat in open air, exposed to weather that would destroy precision equipment within weeks if permanent shelter wasn't completed. The workers lived in tents and railway cars while construction crews from the Red Army Engineering Corps began building the new factory around the machinery. The construction followed a logic that Western industrial practice would consider backwards. Normally, you built the factory first, then installed equipment. The Soviets reversed the sequence. They positioned the critical manufacturing equipment exactly where it needed to operate, then constructed walls and roofs around it. The machinery determined the building's shape, not the other way around. Engineer Dmitry Vulov supervised the reassembly of production line number 3, the automated system that installed T-34 transmission assemblies. The line consisted of 47 separate machines that needed to be positioned within millimeter tolerances to function properly. Vulov worked from engineering drawings that had been folded and unfolded so many times the paper was splitting along the creases. He checked measurements with instruments designed for precision work in climate-controlled environments, while his breath froze in clouds and his fingers lost feeling through insulated gloves. The electrical systems presented challenges that pushed Soviet engineering improvisation to its limits. The Kharkov factory had drawn power from Ukraine's electrical grid with transformers and distribution equipment designed for predictable voltage and capacity. Point 112 had no electrical grid. Army engineers strung temporary lines from a hydroelectric plant 32 miles away, running cables on wooden poles that workers cut from nearby forests and erected in ground that had already begun to freeze. The power supply was intermittent. The voltage fluctuated wildly. Equipment designed for steady industrial current received surges that burned out motors and control systems. Workers slept 4 hours per night and returned to assembly tasks that required concentration and precision while exhausted. Women who had worked administrative jobs in Kharkov now operated welding equipment and assembly tools, learning manufacturing skills during 18-hour shifts in unheated buildings. Teenagers too young for military conscription calibrated precision instruments that determined whether tank gun barrels would fire accurately. The workforce included engineers with advanced degrees and farm workers who had never seen a factory before October. They worked together because the alternative was letting German industrial capacity outproduce Soviet defenses. The first test of electrical systems came on November 19th, 42 days after the evacuation order reached Kharkov. Engineers connected a single production line to the new power supply and attempted to run a trial assembly sequence. The motors engaged. The conveyor systems moved. The automated tools performed their programmed functions. The line operated for 6 minutes before a voltage spike destroyed 2 motor controllers and shut down the entire system. Vulov ordered his team to rebuild the damaged components using spare parts that had been damaged during transport. By late November, temperatures at point 112 dropped to 20 degrees below 0 Celsius. Workers wrapped machinery in canvas tarps to protect precision components from ice formation. The factory walls were complete, but the heating system wasn't operational yet. Production crews wore every layer of clothing they owned while operating equipment that required bare-handed manipulation for final adjustments. Frostbite casualties exceeded injury rates from industrial accidents. The factory hospital, operating out of 4 railway cars, treated hypothermia cases alongside the usual manufacturing injuries. Maksarev walked through the partially completed factory on December 1st, reviewing progress against the impossible schedule the State Defense Committee had mandated. Tank production was supposed to resume by December 15th. His engineers told him they needed another month. The party chairman reminded him that Moscow was under siege, that German forces were within artillery range of the Kremlin, and that every T-34 not being produced was one more advantage for Wehrmacht panzer divisions. The first T-34 tank rolled off the reassembled production line on December 8, 1941. It was 61 days after the evacuation order, 2,100 miles from where the factory had originally stood. The tank's armor plating showed welding imperfections that quality control would have rejected in peacetime. The engine compartment lacked proper insulation. The turret traverse mechanism operated roughly because reassembly tolerances weren't perfect. But the tank's main gun fired. The engine started, and the tracks engaged when the test driver pressed the controls. Maksarev stood in the freezing factory and watched workers paint identification numbers on Soviet armor that shouldn't exist. Then he drafted a telegram to Moscow reporting that factory number 37 had resumed production. He didn't mention that this was one factory among 1,500, or that the same impossible resurrection was happening simultaneously across the Urals, in Siberia, in Kazakhstan, wherever Soviet engineers had found open ground and railway access. He just reported that the Kharkov Tractor Factory was back in the war. December 22nd, 1941. London, Cabinet War Rooms beneath Whitehall. Winston Churchill read the updated Soviet industrial assessment for the third time, trying to find the error in the mathematics that would make the numbers sensible. The report came from multiple intelligence sources that had been cross-referenced and verified over 6 weeks. Signals intelligence from Bletchley Park. Photographic reconnaissance from RAF flights over Soviet territory. Reports from British liaison officers working with Soviet commands. Information from Polish intelligence networks still operating behind German lines. Every source confirmed the same conclusion. The Soviets had successfully relocated and restarted production at over 1,000 factories. Churchill's military secretary, General Hastings Ismay, stood near the map table where colored pins tracked the Eastern Front. The German advance had stalled outside Moscow as winter temperatures plunged and Soviet resistance stiffened. Wehrmacht units that had covered hundreds of miles in summer were now fighting for individual villages. The Red Army was launching counterattacks with tank formations that shouldn't exist, according to German intelligence assessments from November. The British analysis identified specific industrial achievements that redefined what was possible under wartime conditions. The Zaporozhstal steel plant, which produced armor plate for tank manufacturing, had been dismantled and moved 1,800 miles to Magnitogorsk in the Urals. The plant resumed steel production 43 days after arriving at its new location. The Moscow aviation plant, which manufactured Yak fighters, evacuated to Novosibirsk in Siberia and delivered its first aircraft 62 days after the move. The Leningrad Kirov Factory, the Soviet Union's primary tank producer, was now operating as 3 separate facilities spread across the Urals, collectively producing more T-34s than the original Leningrad plant had manufactured at peak capacity. Churchill studied the production figures that British industrial analysts had compiled from intercepted Soviet communications. In October, when the evacuations were at their peak and German forces threatened Moscow, Soviet tank production had dropped to 156 units. In November, as factories restarted in their new eastern locations, production climbed to 583 tanks. December's preliminary estimates suggested production would exceed 800 tanks, possibly approaching 1,000. Germany's monthly tank production, according to British intelligence estimates, was approximately 360 units. The strategic implications sat on Churchill's desk like a chess position that had suddenly reversed. Britain had entered its alliance with the Soviet Union, expecting to support a nation fighting for survival, buying time with British blood while Soviet resistance delayed German forces. The assumption embedded in every British strategic calculation was that German industrial superiority would eventually overwhelm Soviet defensive capacity, regardless of how bravely the Red Army fought. That assumption was disintegrating. Churchill pulled another document from the intelligence folder. This one analyzed Soviet railway operations during the evacuation period. Between July and November 1941, Soviet railways had moved 1.5 million railway cars eastward, carrying factory equipment, raw materials, workers, and entire populations of industrial cities. The operation had continued while German aircraft bombed rail lines, while partisan warfare disrupted transportation networks, while locomotive maintenance deteriorated from overuse. The evacuation had moved more industrial capacity in 4 months than Britain had built during 2 decades of peacetime development. The report included translated excerpts from captured German documents analyzing the same Soviet evacuation. Wehrmacht intelligence officers initially dismissed the operation as propaganda, impossible to execute during active combat operations. Then, German forces captured evacuation sites and found empty factories stripped to bare foundations. The Wehrmacht revised its assessments, but still calculated that Soviet industrial capacity would take 18 months to recover, assuming the factories could be restarted at all. Soviet production had resumed in weeks, not years. Churchill set the papers down and looked at Ismay. The general had fought in the previous war, understood logistics and industrial capacity in ways that shaped military outcomes more decisively than battlefield tactics. Ismay's expression suggested he was performing the same strategic recalculation that Churchill was working through. Britain had built its wartime industrial mobilization on plans developed over years. Factories had expanded gradually. Production lines had been optimized methodically. Supply chains had been secured through careful diplomatic and economic arrangements. The British approach was careful, methodical, and entirely consistent with how Western industrial nations prepared for mechanized warfare. The Soviets had accomplished more in 3 months of desperate improvisation than Britain had managed in 3 years of deliberate planning. They had done it while losing battles, while retreating across hundreds of miles, while German armies captured cities and killed civilians by the hundreds of thousands. They had moved steel mills, aircraft plants, tank factories, chemical facilities, and electronics manufacturing across distances that exceeded the entire width of Western Europe. And they had done it under threats of execution for failure, with workers who slept in railway cars and assembled machinery in open fields during winter conditions that would have stopped British industrial operations completely. Churchill realized he had underestimated Stalin's industrial capacity by margins that made his previous strategic assumptions dangerously wrong. More importantly, he understood that Germany had made the same mistake. Wehrmacht commanders had calculated their invasion timeline based on destroying Soviet industrial capacity in the Western territories. They had succeeded in capturing those territories, but the capacity had vanished before German forces arrived, then reappeared 1,000 miles east, producing tanks and aircraft that were now stopping German advances. The Eastern Front wasn't going to collapse. The Soviet Union wasn't going to surrender. And the industrial foundation that made that survival possible had been created through an engineering and logistical achievement that military theory said couldn't be done. Churchill looked at the production estimates again, understanding that the numbers represented something beyond industrial statistics. They represented a fundamental shift in the war's strategic balance, accomplished by workers and engineers who had achieved the impossible because Stalin's system gave them no alternative except death. He had underestimated the Russians by an order of magnitude. The question now was whether Hitler would realize his mistake before it was too late. January 1942. Across the Ural Mountains, Siberia, and Central Asia, the Soviet industrial evacuation was not a single factory story repeated 1,500 times. It was 1,500 unique catastrophes, each one overcome through methods that Western industrial management would consider barbaric, and each one essential to Soviet survival. The Stalingrad Tractor Factory, which had switched to T-34 production in 1940, received evacuation orders on August 23, 1941. The workers disassembled the facility while German bombers attacked the city. Production crews loaded machinery onto railway cars between air raids, sometimes abandoning partially loaded equipment when sirens wailed and running for shelters. The final evacuation train departed Stalingrad on September 2nd, while German artillery shells landed on the city's outskirts. The factory relocated to Barnaul in western Siberia, 2,300 miles from its original location. Workers reassembled production equipment in warehouses that had stored grain until the previous month. The first tank emerged from the relocated assembly line on November 14th, 73 days after evacuation. The Moscow ball-bearing plant manufactured precision components essential to aircraft engines, tank transmissions, and artillery mechanisms. Ball bearings required tolerances measured in thousandths of millimeters, produced by equipment so sensitive that vibration from nearby heavy machinery could ruin entire production batches. The plant evacuated to Saratov on the Volga River in October, moving equipment designed for climate-controlled environments into buildings where winter temperatures made steel brittle and lubricants froze solid. Engineers developed new manufacturing procedures that compensated for temperature variations, recalibrating machinery daily as weather conditions changed. Production resumed in December, with output rates that matched the Moscow plant's peacetime capacity. The human cost of these industrial resurrections appeared in statistics that Soviet planners tracked but rarely publicized. Workers at the relocated Magnitogorsk Metallurgical Complex, which produced steel for tank armor, experienced frostbite rates exceeding 40% during the first winter of operation. The facility operated blast furnaces in partially completed buildings where interior temperatures remained below freezing, despite the furnaces radiating enough heat to melt iron. Workers rotated through positions near the furnaces to prevent hypothermia, then returned to assembly tasks that required steady hands and clear vision while their bodies struggled to maintain core temperature. Child labor became standard across the relocated industrial sites. Soviet education regulations required factory employment for citizens as young as 14. But the evacuation crisis reduced that minimum to 12 in practice, sometimes younger. Teenagers operated lathes, welding equipment, and chemical processing machinery that peacetime safety standards would never permit. A 14-year-old worker at the Gorky automobile plant, relocated to Ulyanovsk, could assemble transmission components as quickly as the adult engineers who had trained him. The alternative was stopping production while waiting for workers who didn't exist. Women replaced men across every industrial sector as military conscription drained factories of male workers. The Chelyabinsk tractor plant, which absorbed equipment from 3 different evacuated factories and became known as Tankograd for its massive T-34 production, employed a workforce that was 72% female by early 1942. Women operated overhead cranes, welded armor plate, drove forklifts, and performed maintenance on machinery that weighed dozens of tons. The Soviet system didn't debate whether women could do industrial work traditionally reserved for men. It simply assigned them the jobs and expected results. Production quality suffered in ways that would matter later, but couldn't be addressed immediately. Tank engines manufactured in hastily reassembled plants had service lives 30% shorter than units produced in peacetime facilities. Aircraft stress panels showed weld inconsistencies that increased maintenance requirements. Artillery shells had higher defect rates that occasionally resulted in premature detonations. But the equipment worked well enough to stop German advances, and that sufficiency was all the strategic situation permitted. The Soviet statistical apparatus tracked the evacuation's results with characteristic precision. By January 1942, 1,523 industrial enterprises had been relocated eastward. The operation had moved 17 million tons of equipment. 10 million workers and their families had been transported to new locations. The railway system had completed the evacuation while simultaneously moving military units, supplying frontline armies, and maintaining civilian transportation for a nation of 190 million people. The production results justified methods that had killed thousands through exhaustion, exposure, and industrial accidents. Soviet tank production in January 1942 reached 1,483 units, nearly 5 times the October low point. Aircraft production exceeded 2,000 planes. Artillery production, small arms manufacturing, ammunition output, every category showed production rates climbing toward levels that would eventually exceed German industrial capacity, despite the Soviet Union having lost territories containing 60% of its pre-war coal production, 58% of its steel output, and 41% of its railway network. British intelligence officers analyzing these figures understood they were witnessing something without historical precedent. Nations had relocated individual factories during wartime emergencies. The Soviet Union had relocated its entire industrial base while fighting for survival, then restarted production in time frames that peacetime industrial planning said required years. The achievement was built on methods Britain couldn't replicate and wouldn't want to: forced labor under threat of execution, workers accepting casualties that Western safety regulations considered criminal, children performing industrial tasks that would horrify British factory inspectors. But the results were undeniable. The industrial capacity that Wehrmacht planners expected to capture or destroy in the Western Soviet territories had vanished eastward, then reappeared, producing weapons at rates Germany couldn't match. The evacuation had succeeded not despite Soviet methods, but because those methods permitted achievements that Western industrial practice considered impossible. The Red Army was receiving tanks, aircraft, and artillery in quantities that were changing the Eastern Front's strategic balance. And those weapons were being produced by workers who had accomplished the impossible because Stalin's system offered them no alternative. February 15, 1942, London, Prime Minister's residence at 10 Downing Street. Winston Churchill sat in his study, reviewing intelligence summaries that redefined the war's strategic landscape. The documents spread across his desk represented 6 months of analysis, from the initial reports of Soviet evacuations in July through the production statistics now arriving from British liaison officers working with Soviet commands. The numbers told a story that forced Churchill to reassess assumptions he had held since June 22, 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union. The intelligence briefing prepared by the Joint Intelligence Committee contained production comparisons that revealed the scale of Soviet achievement. In December 1941, Soviet factories produced 1,130 tanks. German factories produced 316. Soviet aircraft production reached 2,000 units, while German production stood at 1,200. The Soviet Union, which had lost territories containing a majority of its pre-war industrial capacity, was now outproducing Germany in the weapons categories that determined mechanized warfare outcomes. Churchill understood industrial capacity in ways that shaped his strategic thinking. He had witnessed how British industrial mobilization developed across 3 years of war preparation, carefully expanding production through measured factory construction and systematic supply chain development. The Soviet achievement compressed that timeline into months, while simultaneously fighting the largest land war in history. More significantly, the Soviets had accomplished this industrial resurrection not through gradual expansion, but through wholesale relocation under combat conditions. The strategic implications extended beyond immediate production statistics. British war planning had operated on assumptions about Soviet survival prospects that now appeared fundamentally wrong. The assumption that German forces would capture or destroy Soviet industrial capacity had been correct regarding territorial conquest, but meaningless regarding industrial survival. The assumption that Soviet resistance would collapse once German armies captured major industrial centers had failed to account for Stalin's willingness to abandon those centers intact, moving their productive capacity beyond German reach. Churchill recognized that Germany had made the same miscalculation, but with more catastrophic consequences. Wehrmacht operational planning for Operation Barbarossa had allocated 6 to 8 weeks for defeating Soviet armed forces, based partly on expectations that capturing Western industrial territories would cripple Soviet war production. German intelligence had correctly identified the locations of Soviet tank plants, aircraft factories, and steel mills. German forces had successfully captured most of those locations, but the victory was hollow because the factories had vanished before Wehrmacht units arrived. The British Prime Minister drafted a memorandum to the War Cabinet summarizing his assessment of Soviet industrial capacity. He wrote that Britain had underestimated Soviet capabilities by margins that made previous strategic calculations dangerously incomplete. The memorandum noted that Soviet methods included practices Britain would consider unacceptable: forced labor, execution threats for production failures, working conditions that caused casualties comparable to military combat, but that the results were undeniable and strategically decisive. Churchill's private conclusion, shared with his closest military advisers, was more direct. He acknowledged that he had fundamentally misjudged Soviet industrial resilience. The admission reflected strategic realism rather than political sentiment. Britain needed the Soviet Union to survive German assault, and that survival now appeared not just possible, but increasingly probable, because of industrial capacity that shouldn't exist according to Western understanding of wartime production logistics. The relocated Soviet factories continued expanding production through early 1942. Tankograd in Chelyabinsk, which combined equipment from the Leningrad Kirov Factory, the Kharkov Tractor Plant, and the Moscow Dynamo Factory, was producing 8 T-34 tanks daily by March. The Gorky automobile plant operating in Ulyanovsk after evacuation manufactured trucks at rates exceeding its peacetime capacity. Aircraft plants scattered across Siberia and the Urals delivered fighters and bombers that began appearing in Soviet air formations in numbers that German intelligence repeatedly underestimated. Churchill's final assessment, delivered to the War Cabinet on February 28, 1942, concluded that the Soviet Union would survive the German invasion and would likely become the dominant military power on the European continent by war's end. This conclusion represented a complete reversal from assessments made 6 months earlier, when British planners questioned whether the Soviet Union would survive past autumn 1941. The change reflected one factor above all others: the successful relocation and restart of Soviet industrial capacity, under conditions that Western military theory considered impossible. The industrial exodus had saved the Soviet Union. More than defensive battles, more than winter weather, more than German tactical errors, the movement of 1,500 factories eastward had created the material foundation for Soviet survival and eventual German defeat. The workers who assembled tanks in unheated buildings during Siberian winters, the engineers who restarted production with improvised equipment and salvaged materials, the railway workers who moved 1.5 million freight cars while German forces advanced. These were the people who had accomplished what Churchill now recognized as the war's most significant industrial achievement. He had underestimated the Russians by an order of magnitude. The admission came from a man who rarely acknowledged strategic miscalculation, but the evidence was undeniable. The Soviet Union had moved and restarted its entire industrial base in 3 months while fighting for survival. The achievement redefined what was possible in wartime industrial mobilization and ensured that German forces would face an enemy whose productive capacity they could never overcome. The relocated factories would produce over 90,000 tanks before war's end, along with hundreds of thousands of aircraft, millions of artillery shells, and the weapons that would carry the Red Army from the Volga to Berlin. All of it built by workers who had crossed the Urals in railway cars, who had assembled machinery in open fields during Russian winter, who had achieved the impossible because Stalin's system gave them no choice but success or death. Churchill closed the intelligence folder and returned to planning Britain's contribution to a war whose outcome was now determined partly by an industrial miracle accomplished through methods Britain could never replicate and victories that human calculation said couldn't be won.